Welcome, everybody, to this breakout session. My name's Juleen Zierath, and I'm a professor of physiology at the Karolinska Institute and a member of the Nobel Assembly. And I have three panelists that I'm going to introduce to you, and we're going to have a lively discussion. So we first have Irna Bokova, and she was the first woman to act as the Director General of UNESCO, where she was engaged in the UN efforts to adopt the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development. We also have Esther Duflo, who received the 2019 Nobel Prize, the Prize in Economics for her experimental approaches to alleviating poverty. And her research is seeking to understand the economic lives of the poor with the aim to help design and evaluate social policies. And we also have John Holmberg with us. He's a professor of physics, resource theory at Chalmers University of Technology in Gothenburg, Sweden. And so I just want to explain the format. And then the point of this is to have a discussion around learning for a sustainable future. The other element of this session is to have a Q&A with members of our audience. So I'll start out with a discussion with the panel. And for people who are watching and viewing, it's already good to start to formulate questions. You're going to see a box on the right hand of your screen, and you can put your questions to the panelists. But I thought I'd take it in three parts. So the first part would be, I would ask Irna to give sort of a framework from what she has learned from her work with Agenda 2030 and to frame some of the important questions for learning for a sustainable future. And then I want to turn to John, and I'd like to give you the opportunity to share some experiences you have with the Challenge Lab that you have set up at Chalmers. And then Esther, I'll have you share some thoughts about perhaps some solutions. You know, how can we solve some of these challenges, and perhaps some of your own experiences, how you can use that to help us look forward. So with that, Irna, maybe I could just give you the floor and you could share some thoughts with us about what are some of the important things we need to be thinking about with 2030 and how we can, learn for a sustainable future.
Well, first of all, thank you for this opportunity to participate in this panel and the week and focus on education. As somebody who was very active in all the debates about Agenda 2030, and particularly on the goal number 4 on education, on inclusive, equitable and quality education and lifelong learning for all, it was very important to inscribe this formulation about education in the global agenda. And it was for the first time, and there were many firsts in the goal number 4. One of the firsts was also education for sustainable development. I'm very happy to see also in this panel Professor Holmberg, who is one of the first, I think, UNESCO chairs on education for sustainable development, and has accompanied the United Nations decade from 2006 to 2014. And nowadays, to look at education and learning, I think learning also is important to emphasize as the foundation of the achievement of Sustainable Development Agenda. Because education, it isn't, I just listened to the debate, it's a passionate, a fascinating debate. Education indeed is about no poverty, it is about gender equality, it is about health, it is about climate change, it is about decent jobs, inequalities, and I can continue the list. So my first point is that education for sustainable development is vital for the future. My second point is, and I will try to be very brief, my second point is that with the COVID-19, we are in a crisis because the pandemic and the lockdowns were a big blow to educational efforts. There was already a learning crisis, and now we add another one. It is very important to look at it and to see how we overcome inequity in education, how we make it inclusive. And the third is very much linked to the second, is about the digital. We are fascinated by the digital. There are a lot of opportunities, incredible opportunities for innovation. But how to make it inclusive, how to give all children access to the digital platforms and to the good quality digital platforms, I think nowadays is vital. Otherwise, we will have a lost generation, and we don't want to have this for the future of our sustainable path of development.
Well, I think you made some excellent points. And one of the most important things you're saying is that lifelong learning, we will be students from basically the time we're coming into this world until the time we leave this world. John, you're doing a lot of work with a challenge lab in Gothenburg. And I thought perhaps, you could share with us some of the work that you have ongoing there.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to do that. And I also want to thank you for this excellent program today. I have learned so much, and I can subscribe to be seen as a student, to support students to learn while creating value for society, rather than just talk about the problem, and also moving behind the dogmas in schools. And maybe also I will particularly address a different approach to learning, that we might need to rethink a little bit what we're doing in schools and elsewhere when it comes to learning. And Gregory Bateson, he suggested 3 levels of learning. The first level is about doing things better. Almost all learning that is done in schools, corporations, municipalities, and elsewhere only reach this first level. We act as we are on the right path and are trying to improve what we already do, focus on getting the right answers and avoiding mistakes. We often have the feeling of being controlled and measured by people that think they are in control. And we can call this the cruise mode. For transformation, I think we need to reach the second and third level of learning. That is what we're trying to do then in Challenge Lab. And it can be seen as an expedition compared to this cruise mode. While the first level of learning is focusing on solutions, the second level is about doing better things. Here we instead stay with the problem and ask why we have the problem and what the big picture look like. Entering the field of system thinking is about addressing the right problem before searching solutions, and often the solution is to be found somewhere else than we first thought. A really good expedition also reaches the third level, and that is seeing things differently. But reconceiving is difficult. It is hard to learn if you already know. So in Challenge Lab, we therefore think that these 3 levels of outside-in learning needs to be supported with an inside-out learning. And inside-out learning starts with the recognition that I am part of the system I seek to change, as pointed out by Peter Senge. It is a reflection on my most important values in life, which give me direction. It's also a reflection of my perspectives. David Bohm said, we do not describe the world we see, but we see the world we describe. And it's also about my willingness to listen to others and challenge my assumptions and goals, asking, how can I be wrong about this, rather than seek to be right? So transform our world, we need more expedition and system thinking in schools and in all kinds of organizations, not instead of cruise mode, but as an important complement. And maybe the motto we have borrowed from Göran Karlstedt and used in Challenge Lab can be useful. Think big, start small, and act now. Well, to be part of something.
I think those are good points to reflect on. Esther, I want to turn to you because we really need to move into action. And it's one thing to have grand ideas, but we also want to ensure that we move forward with these ideas. And, you've been so incredibly successful in your work. So how do you see us moving forward? How do we actually move from ideas to action to reality? We actually don't hear you, Esther. No, we still are. I think you're still on mute, so we're still missing you here. I think now. All right. I will. Hold on to that thought, and I will take one of the questions that we have from our audience, Esther. Can you try once again, Esther? I think, Esther, I'll hold on to that, and I will take a question from our audience. One of the questions that we have is learning to influence politicians and others essential for sustainability? And I think perhaps, John, you touched a little bit upon that. Okay. and I can hear Esther too, so we'll let John answer this question, then we'll come back to Esther. But is learning to influence politicians and others essential for sustainability? John or Irina, any thoughts around that? We need to teach the politicians as well. Is that essential?
Yeah, but I of course, everyone. But maybe the most powerful thing is not to teach, but to learn. So asking question might be stronger actually than trying to teach and convince.
Okay.
To invite them to conversation and ask relevant question they have to answer to, and try to figure out how the system works together rather than trying to convince them to be right.
Okay.
That is my
If
short
I may
answer.
just to say one
Go
word,
ahead,
I think
go
it's
ahead,
an important question. I don't think teaching them, but holding them accountable.
Okay.
And I could say from my perspective of international organization, it is important that governments, politicians are held accountable to what they have been agreeing. I'm speaking about sustainable development, agenda, climate, and all the others.
Okay. All right. Well, I think that's a good point. And, there is a lot of buy-in, so then there needs to be sort of action. So, Esther, we can move back to you. I think you're coupled in now.
Yes.
Oh, great.
Sorry. So I respectfully disagree with the not teaching them. I actually think that once you hold them accountable and once there is willingness to act on improving education, then there is a ton of things politicians don't know, policymakers, I would say, don't know, and a ton of things we don't know. And in fact, over the last 30 years, there have been considerable progress in education in some ways, with now almost everywhere except in countries that really war-torn, most kids going to school, at least for the primary levels. And we're also making progress on the secondary level. But where they have a complete stalling of progress is on learning, that they are going to school and then they are not learning anything. So, for example, in India, they can, about half of the kids who have gone to school till the end of primary school can read at the first grade level. And that's not isolated for India. It's something you're finding from country after country after country. So the real crisis is learning. And it's, of course, was learning until COVID hit. And now, of course, it's like demultiplied by the fact that it's demultiplied by the fact that the COVID crisis hit, and the reaction of most countries in developing countries was to keep students home, as it was in rich countries. But for most developing countries, they haven't gone back, and there is not yet a definite plan for how they are going to come back. So it's an extremely long interruption, and it's a crisis on top of a crisis. Now, it could also be an opportunity for action, precisely because one of the big problems of leading to the lack of learning in schools was the attempt in many developing countries to teach a unified curriculum to everyone, regardless of what they come up with, their support system, how much they could be helped at home. And there is a lot of diversity in the classroom that was not reflected by diversity in the way that the teaching goes. And this uniform, elite-biased teaching coupled with wide diversity of levels meant that most kids were actually completely lost in the classroom, which is why they understood nothing. So with the COVID crisis, we arrive at a situation where this is going to be the same problem multiplied by thousands, because people would have had very, very different experience during the crisis itself. And it's an opportunity for policymakers to say, okay, how do we address this? Do we go back to try to teach the same curriculum, or do we try and do something different? And that's where the teaching can happen. Not us teaching them, but like experiences from one place to move to another places, learning from what works and what doesn't work in a rigorous way. So the way you get action is by, trying something. As John said, try it small, trying something, evaluate it rigorously, and if it works, scale it up.
All right. Well, that was an excellent point. And in fact, one of the questions we received from the participants is sort of dovetailing right into this. So in a world where communities struggle to meet basic needs, how would you persuade governments to place education as a top priority? Does anybody there want to jump to this one? How do you persuade the governments? Go ahead, Irina.
Well, I have confronted many times this question, saying that education is very expensive, it's complicated, there are other urgent needs. But we all know that if you try ignorance, we see the devastating result in many societies. I do believe that those countries and those societies, those communities are getting out of crisis much better and much faster, whatever crisis, natural disaster, conflict and others, when kids go to school. If they don't go to school, there is no normalcy in the community. There is a lost, as we say, generations for the future, and there is no way other sustainable development goals or other problems in societies can be solved. So I think investing in education is one of the best investments that a government can make in order to get out of the crisis.
Mm-hmm. John, do you want to add to that?
I just want to say that UNESCO also this week celebrated the 60 years anniversary of this treaty, the right to education. So it's so extremely important. And when that is what UNESCO really do best, to put pressure on nations, and I enjoy that very much. Another thing that I really enjoyed at UNESCO, it was actually when I went to a meeting, and when you had a photo gallery on the wall around the UNESCO headquarters in Paris, one big photo for one student on his and her way to school. I think the photo gallery was called Journeys to School. It was so fantastic. Do you remember that? You must have had a lot of...
We opened it in New York at the headquarters of the United Nations, and then we made a big publication. I think it was beautiful to see all different circumstances. Children were...
It tells so much about what we are talking. All the emotion and everything. So it was fantastic. Yeah.
Well, action is really important, and people are really burning for that. And another question that we received from our audience is, we need to act now, but what action do we need from young people? That was a question. We talked about government's role, but what action do we need from people on the, citizens, young citizens who are looking at their future? Esther.
Yes, I'm very happy to answer this question because I've worked with a wonderful education movement in India called Pratham, which gives us really an example of how to use the young people, the older brothers and sisters in the communities to help their younger siblings to learn. And basically going back to the fact that the central problem of schools is that people are getting there, they have a right to an education, but they are not actually learning. Mm-hmm. One way that they can learn is if we go and teach at the right level. So if a kid arrives in grade 5 and is not able to read, it's not because they are not able to, it's because nobody has taught them yet. Mm-hmm. And that is something that the older sister and brothers can do. In fact, we have evaluated on large scale and then Pratham has scaled up across millions of children in India and now in Africa, these models where this is the older kids in the community after a very short training who go back to the school and help the teacher with forming little groups for the kids to be able to learn exactly at the level where they are. And once they are caught up, they can go back to the curriculum. So if there is a willingness again and an ability to do that with policymakers, which I think there might be post-COVID, then they will be needing a lot of young people to participate in this movement.
Yeah, and I think that's really exciting because it's very gratifying to be able also to see the fruits of that as well. There's two sides to that, the learning element and also the mentorship aspects that come in as well. There are a lot of questions about COVID, and one question is, could the COVID-19 crisis be used to rethink the ways of learning and applying sustainability? And we've lost Esther, but perhaps we could turn to you, John.
Yes, it can, of course, if you have access to the technology. But that is the starting point for many students around the world and also many schools that have access to this remote learning technology. But if you have, it is of course a huge opportunity to have a meet. We have had meetings with students in South Africa just a couple of weeks ago, and that worked fantastic. It was as they were in the room. So there open up also possibilities. You open up possibility to flip classroom. So you get the presentation before you meet, and then you have discussion and dialogues when you meet. Mm-hmm. So that is a possibility, of course. Mm-hmm. May I also just add to what Esther said? I totally agree with teaching at the right level, and it relates to Ryan and Decky when they talk about intrinsic motivation. Right competence level is important, but they also talk about 2 other levels, factors that is important for creating this intrinsic motivation about students, to make them active, and that is to give them a space where they are seen and are trusted to even make mistakes. And that space needs to be, they have to feel a feeling of safety. So it's okay to make mistakes. And it's it's also some meaning in that space. Mm-hmm. So they contribute to something that is bigger. Mm-hmm. And if you just create a space, it's my experience is that students fill that space very quickly. And you can just support them and facilitate them, but we don't dare really to give them the space, and that is a problem, I think.
Okay, well, that's important as well. We're coming up to where we need to start to round off, but I do want to ask one other question here to Irina, and it's you've worked a lot on Goal 4, but there's a lot of questions related to Goal 5, achieving gender equity and empowering women and girls. And one of the questions come up is, how do we actually break down the disparity between males and females, women and children, girls and boys in terms of education and science and engineering? So I thought maybe you could share a few thoughts on that.
As I said, the Sustainable Development Agenda, all the goals are very intrinsically linked. They're interdependent, they're very, very close, and definitely goal number 4 and 5 are there in order to empower women, to give girls the opportunity to go to school, and also to have inclusive education. I think one of the most important is to look at what are those impediments that do not give the right to education of girls, be it because of poverty, because of belonging to a minority, because of the lack of safe schools, because of stereotyping. I think this is the beginning. The second, of course, is to create an enabling environment. Girls will go to school if there is an enabling environment. There may be the respective laws, but there is no such support from a community or from a family. And I have probably visited schools in 50 countries, and I have seen how important this enabling environment is there. And the other side of the question, as you mentioned, is about girls and STEM education, girls and mathematics, girls, as we say, in a STEAM education nowadays, because it's also about arts, about creativity. I think it is extremely important to, once again, to look at how we can change the perception about girls in the new technologies. UNESCO published last year a very interesting report about artificial intelligence and gender biases. I think if we don't look at this particular aspect of now, we will build this stereotyping into the artificial intelligence, and it will be reproduced for the future. We should not allow this to happen.
Okay. All right. Final word, Esther, just briefly, any thoughts for the future? Moving to action.
I think here we have to go back to what Irina started with, which is if this current cohort is sacrificed, we are going to pay the cost of the COVID crisis, not next year, not next decade, but for the foreseeable future. So it should really be the priority of everyone in the world to think about how we can now have the kids back in school, and once they're back in school and learning. Mm-hmm. And we actually now have a lot of models for how to get it done. We discussed one here, but there are others that have been proven scientifically that can be adopted. And this is the time to empower countries financially to do it, for countries to be empowered to do it, and to really make it the priority of 2021.
All right. I think that's a wonderful, wonderful thought for us to leave on. We need to take action, and we need to really think about the future as well. What we do today is really going to have a big impact on how we live in our world tomorrow. So with that, I want to thank the panelists. It's a pity we couldn't be here, but this virtual medicine, this virtual magic is really fantastic. So have a great afternoon, and thanks again for your input.